Okay, hi there everyone. I'm trying this another way, and I'm hoping this will work. Just going to record this in a Skype presentation. So here is what I wanted you to see. So, just a few words about why I've embarked on this project. Um, okay, just checking to make sure I was recording. I think I am. So reworking these performance measures, I think the biggest goal I had in mind was to just give them better focus and clarity. So you'll see here places where we've taken out measures that maybe have outlived their usefulness and tried to rework some that have caused confusion in the past. Also, hoping that doing this leads to getting more meaningful, reliable data in a number of areas that you see there. And of course, too, cleaning up the report format to make it a little easier to use. Um, I don't, you don't see the full report altogether in these slides, but I think that's going to be pretty easy thing to work through together when we get an opportunity. So what I'm looking for out of all this from you is really just showing you all the proposed changes, getting any feedback and questions you have. I'll mention that I'm trying to meet with ICA on Thursday, April 9th, to go over the final draft and get them working on this. So trying to get feedback before then. And, one thing to mention in this presentation, I'm not showing really minor changes, so defined as, things that may show up in the quarterly report tab, but that aren't going to require you to do anything extra, that ICA can get on the back end from things we already have. Okay, so the first group of measures here, just a quickly kind of highlights of the conversation that I had with the performance measures work group back in February. These are some of the areas we covered, right? A lot of discussion of the community connections measures and some of the issues that come up with those. Ditto the adult health and wellness section, especially looking at the sobriety and recovery measures and how those have been fairly confusing. Engagement and child safety were also areas that we delved into. And I'll just say thank you again to those of you who participated in that work group. Really appreciate it to get your perspectives. Okay. So as we go through here, you're going to see some slides that show, screenshots of the actual measures from the new report format. So text that's in green, that's something new I'm putting in. Strike through, as you would imagine. Why did that advance? Strike through, as you'd imagine, is something that's deleted, and highlighted means pay particular attention to that. Okay, so the first section of revisions here, I just want to look at some stuff in the housing status section of the report. Basically, what this comes down to is trying to clean up some of our measures around the time that families remain homeless before they're housed. So we'll look right at the measures here. And I apologize if these are a little small. I'll also share these slides with you, so you can pull them up on the computer and look if you need it larger. Let's see, what do I want to talk about here? Yeah. So basically, we'd historically, I think, had some confusion in how we were gathering this measure here. Median number of days families are homeless prior to being housed, have a lease through the program. When I dug into this with ICA, they told me that the way this was set up apparently was originally through OEO was to capture the entire history of homelessness that a family had, right? So whatever whatever the date is in HMIS, that may have even been reported by another provider at some point, that they became homeless, that date forward until you house them in the FSH program. I think based on what I've seen in the reports, I wonder if different sites have been reporting this one in different ways. So at any rate, when I do the data manual that goes along with these new measures, give you that guidance, we'll have a very clear definition of how this measure is to be reported in there going forward. So above it in green is the, well, what I'm calling a new, in quotes, measure. Median number of days families are homeless from program entry to housing move-in date. So this is trying to capture how long is a family homeless from the point they enroll in FSH up until they lease up. So I would just think it's helpful to gather both of those data points. Obviously this new one in green is just to give us insight into what that looks like for you region by region, maybe their challenges. It might, inform us to reach out to a particular site and offer training technical assistance if we see you have a long period, right? So at any rate, just to say a little bit about, the reasoning on our end for that one. The existing measure that I'm going to clarify the guidance about, I think that's helpful for us to get a sense of, what does the picture of homelessness look like for the entire population, right? What's the demographic piece here? How long do families tend to be homeless coming into the program? Other minor changes, just striking this term family supported here out of this measure. I'm not really sure why it was ever worded that way. You're not running your own housing sites. I think we're just looking at how long have people retained housing, period. So making that minor adjustment. This is one in particular where I'd love to get some feedback, number, percent of families current with rent. We discussed it at OEO, and we don't feel we need that broken out. From what I understand the history of all this, I think this was a measure that was requested at one point by FSH providers years ago. Oh, come on. Basically we're interested in knowing our family's in good standing with the landlord, right? So I'm planning to take this one out. If you really have strong feelings it's useful for you to see this broken out on the report, feel free to contact me and tell me that. If I hear that from a lot of sites, I'll leave it in. But if I don't hear that feedback, I'm planning to strike it just to kind of get rid of things that are somewhat duplicated. Okay, so since Skype is eager to have me move the slides, let's look at the next one. So child health and safety, a lot of changes here. We'll talk about them in more detail when we see the slide. We previously were gathering a lot of detail about the different kinds of family services, case statuses. I've come to the conclusion that I don't think it's necessary or helpful for us to do that, really. Adding a child care enrollment measure, which I'll talk about, and with the hope, the ultimate aim of really trying to build a base of data over time that gives us insight into what case closures and reunifications look like for families who participate in the FSH program. I'm hoping that this can be something we can use and say, hey, look, we have a really positive impact here. So again, the measures themselves, a lot of changes, getting rid of, like I was saying in the previous slide, these two case types specific measures. What I heard from the FSH sites and in the work group when we talked about it is that given kind of the range in relationships with family services workers, that a lot of times this information is maybe coming from the families themselves. And of course, I don't think we can reasonably expect, and I think the folks on the work group certainly agreed with this or acknowledged it. I don't think we can really expect that they're going to be on top of necessarily what FSD's lingo for their case is, right? It changes, it's confusing, sometimes there's concurrent planning. So, going to get rid of those. I don't think they've been reliable based on the way they've been gathered. So we're just going to focus on, is their custody case open or not? Down here, you know, the suggestion came up, which I thought made sense, that, you know, you don't really need to gather both in-home and out-of-home. You can just gather out-of-home, and in-home is the reciprocal of that, right? So I'm going to roll with that. That makes sense to me, just to simplify things. I won't say a lot about this next one here, but it made sense to me when I looked at this because these are all point-in-time measures that percentages would be calculated on, you know, the active end of quarter number, not the cumulative number of families. I won't really highlight these changes as we go through here, aside from this one. Just know that you may see me tweaking some of those calculates fields based on that. You know, I think that just needs to be cleaned up in some of this. Lastly, adding a new measure in green down here, a number of families with DCF case at enrollment who had a child return to the family's custody during the fiscal year. So again, it's just there as a way to start building a base of data around, you know, what does this look like in the FSH program, right? When we have family services involved families, who does get returned to the family year after year, and how can we compare those numbers to family services, and maybe, you know, be able to say, hey, we have a real impact in this. So that's the idea around gathering that. I'm hoping as an annual thing it won't be too onerous to do. So this would be something that would get added to, you know, the questions you ask for the quarter 4 assessment. Okay, so here's another section of, you know, the child health and safety piece that I thought it made sense to rename this health and supportive services. No real changes here other than adding a child care enrollment measure. This was something that came from the latest FSH advisory group meeting. One of the folks from the Child Development Division who attends that suggested it. I quite honestly was on the fence about this idea. And then COVID-19 really turned me around because I think that obviously we're seeing that there's a pretty massive disruption to the childcare system. And I think it will be good for us to have a sense of who gets reconnected after this. Also, one of the things that the CDD staff pointed out is that family services involved families get some extra services and supports when they have their children enrolled in a licensed childcare program. I apologize, I have to look back in my notes, which I still haven't done. I can't remember offhand what those benefits were. I think it gives access to an extra support worker to work with the child. So at any rate, it seems like that's a really good thing to track because, oh, come on. You hear my frustration there, sorry. I think that's a really good thing to track so we can get a sense of what children do we have on caseloads who are able to access those services. And it's also something that I'm going to invite CDD into a COP as soon as I can to do some training with us about that. Okay, and I am kind of racing through these. I apologize, but I figure you will be able to pause on your end when you review them. So, okay, so looking at engagement and adult health, a lot of changes in this area as well. A lot of this comes down to updating the community connections measures that we had. A lot of discussion in the work group and prior to having the work group really about how those are pretty confusing and problematic. So there's a social connections assessment, which I'll say more about, which is something that I'm looking at adding. Adding a measure for engagement with service providers, removing some of those existing community development measures and networks measures that weren't working very well. I mean, and you see some of the impacts there, right? Hopefully better alignment with strengthening families, and some more objective data in some of these areas. Okay, also, other changes, updates to substance misuse measures, trying to do a better job capturing the number of people who would know substance use over time, and I'll say more about that. Also tracking linkage to treatment with that subgroup. Getting rid of the recovery and sobriety measures, which weren't giving us meaningful info. And essentially just impacts getting more accurate information in all of these areas, we hope. All right, so here are the engagement slides. So number percent, sorry, I just need to collect my thoughts. So the main change in green here, number and percent of families with increased social support score. So what this is all about, you'll see in a future slide, is trying to get at a way to assess from the family's perspective what is the quality of their social support, what is the quality of their social relationships, how do they feel about that, rather than this kind of broad, confusing measure around that we had in the past. So this would function a lot like the financial capability scale, where you would ask a series of 5 questions, get a score from that, do that at enrollment, and then do it again at the end of the year, and then we just measure their change. The other new measure in this particular section, number percent of families actively engaging with service providers during the quarter and annually. A discussion that came up in the work group, and also when we talked about this at OEO, is wanting to be able to have a way to capture both formal and informal supports. So this measure would be things like, have you made a referral for mental health services or treatment, or have you helped the family, arrange regular appointments with their physician, family services involvement. What are these services that families are linked with, and what are they doing to follow up, right? So the idea here, and one thing that I heard from the work group as well, is that when you think about engagement, a lot of you are really looking at that as defining engagement, right? As families who are proactively reaching out to you, families who are proactively maintaining relationships with service providers that you link them with and help them get connected with. So I will put a definition to this effect in the data guidance. So that's what this would be trying to capture, right? The number of families, when we say engaging, actively engaging, the number of families who are proactively doing this. And, in developing the data guidance, I'll consult with you all to really get a good working definition of this we can all use. The last change here is removing the number of families with care coordination plan with external partnerships. You'll see I'm removing all these plan measures as we go through. I just don't think they were serving us well. I'm not interested in seeing, did you make a plan to do something? I'm more interested in seeing, well, what were the results, right? So, and also I think a lot of this stuff, when it comes to case planning, I'm going to incorporate into some guidance about case planning for the provider manual. So more on that later. Okay, so here are those proposed social supports questions. These come from a tool called the Protective Factors Survey, which some of you may be familiar with. To say a little bit about that briefly, It's a tool that allows providers to, get a sense of where families stand in regard to the protective factors, right? I want to stress that I'm not talking about using that entire tool. I actually don't love the whole tool. I think, in particular, some of the child welfare questions are kind of problematic and loaded in a negative way. So if you look at the whole tool, understand that. I don't want to use all of it. But I think we can pull out these 5 questions to use to gauge, how do families feel about their social supports from their own perspective, right? And I think that's the thing that really counts and that we want to look at. Some of the existing measures we had, I think, were problematic in this area because they kind of drove, in my mind, this or they have the potential to drive kind of a situation where, you might be asking families, oh, have you thought about joining this group? Are you in that group? Are you in that group? Are you doing this thing? And, while, yes, I mean, you do want to encourage families when they indicate an openness or willingness to maybe engage in, I don't know, a group from their children's school, right? Like maybe an after school program or something, or parents group related to that, right? I think we also want to tread a line where we're not trying to like impose things on families that we quote think are good for them, right? So that's what I like about this tool is it lets you just ask the families, well, how do you feel about these 5 things here? Gather their thoughts, and then convert that to a number. And like I said earlier, this would function a lot like the financial capability scale. So I don't think you're going to be able to get these links in these slides. So I'll try to send the links separately in the email that I send out with this. But there's a link to the Protective Factor Survey tool and also a page that talks about how it was developed. Okay. So substance misuse and mental health, and I don't know why some of these measures are grouped here. It's kind of a mistake on my part, but I'll just talk about them here. So the first thing I think you'll notice here is a terminology change. Number of adults with known substance misuse. This was something that Christy from Upper Valley Haven brought up in our work group, that this is really the correct terminology at this point, not substance abuse, which I think is what we had before. So just wanting to align, our measures with the best terminology here. So that's just a minor change there. The next one down, what number of adults who have known substance misuse during the quarter. What I want to do with that one is, put that question on the quarterly assessment, right? And what I saw happening previously is that we had this discrepancy in the report when I looked at it at the end of the year. The number of people reported on this top measure, substance misuse reported in enrollment was pretty low. And then we have much higher numbers, reported for engaging in treatment or recovery, sobriety, etc. And so, in talking with all you and thinking about it, I think what's been happening is that, if you only ask this question or you only get this information at enrollment when you don't have a relationship yet with the family, well, it follows that, families might not really be wanting to talk about that with a service coordinator they just met yesterday, right? So I'm hoping what will happen here is that by having this on the quarterly assessment, we might be able to see, gather some just more accurate, less skewed numbers. That's what I'm hoping for. This next measure here, adults with known substance misuse currently receiving treatment. So that's really trying to look at, okay, of the people who report that this is a priority for them, they are experiencing substance misuse, and they want to work on it. Of the people who report that, how many ultimately connect with some form of treatment? And so treatment, is something that is a term that I will define in our data guidance when I develop that. And that's something also that I'm going to bring back in the development of that to all of you to really talk about, well, what does this encompass? What do we mean when we say treatment? What kinds of things should we be including in that, right? Knowing that everybody's recovery journey looks pretty different and different things work for different people. So that's something we'll talk about together as we're able to do it. Okay, so a lot of stuff I'm removing. Well, this one down here, number of adults currently receiving substance treatment services would just be replaced with the one above I was just talking about. Getting rid of the recovery and sobriety measures. Both of those, in talking with the work group in this area, and I'd heard from all of you previously, just they're too open-ended. It's very hard, I think, particularly with recovery, to write a definition that allows you to collect that accurately. So going to say goodbye to those. Ditto our two measures around linkages to networks of other provider organizations and the community development measures. My thinking is that this first one here, families with linkages to networks of other providers, etc., is replaced by the social supports measure and by that engagement with services measure I was talking about earlier, right? That between those two, we will hopefully get a more accurate look at kind of the broad net this previous measure was trying to capture, right? Community development, again, in the work group from all of you prior to that, I just, don't need to say much about it. I think you weren't finding many families that you felt fit that. It wasn't clear what that meant, and thus we weren't really getting, productive data out of gathering that. So I think we can just be done with that. Community engagement plan, again, getting rid of that, and then in lieu of that, trying to measure that in a report, just having guidance for you in case planning in the provider manual about, well, what does it mean to help a family plan for community engagement when that's something that's a priority to them. The satisfaction survey, I'll confess I never really knew exactly what that was supposed to be. I think maybe something akin to the 360 self-eval that we're putting in place with monitoring, so not really seeing a need to measure how many of you are giving out a survey like that in the report. Okay, on to financial capability. So the oh my God, I just realized something. Okay, probably you all just saw me check to see if my microphone was turned on. Anyway, sorry about that. Financial capability. So, updates to the measures here. Making some changes to the employment measures that I'll talk about when we get in there. Adding an employment retention measure. Simplifying the reach up piece. Adding a banked unbanked measure. and removing the checking account measure we used to have. And particularly, and this is something that came more out of my discussions with Sarah at OEO, we're hoping that by tweaking the employment measures in the way I'm going to talk about here in a moment, we can get kind of a more detailed picture of what employment looks like for FSH families, which I think will be helpful for us. And, just thinking further about training and technical support in this area. And then having the financial capability measures focused in general, on the highest impact areas for FSH families. Okay, so the changes here. First off, we're going to stop tracking part-time and full-time employment separately. We're just going to look at did unemployed families secure employment or not. We weren't really doing anything with part-time versus full-time. So when you see down here, some of the stuff in green, one thing we're going to try to do is track, and this is something ICA has told me they can get from the information they already gather on the back end. So this stuff I'm about to talk about here should not require you doing anything extra new from what I understand from them, which is good. But what we're going to try to do is have the report show us for both unemployed adults and employed adults who enters job training or education, right? Because we realize, well, just because you are employed doesn't mean you might not want to do training and get into some other career. So we want to look at those numbers broken out by both of those populations. We want to be able to see, of course, the number of unemployed adults who secure employment, but also other income, right? So basically that would be a count of who's going on SSDI or SSI. And, again, that's something that ICA has told me they can get from using the income information that's already updated regularly by you in HMIS. Number of employed adults who lost employment. I think, that's something we weren't necessarily getting a picture of before. But I think it would be helpful for us to help inform kind of what does employment retention look like in the FSH population, and is there something there we should pay attention to or not? And then the highlighted one, number of adults who maintained employment for 6 or more months as an annual measure. This came out of the work group kind of indirectly. I think it was Amy Beston who made the really good observation that it would be great if we had some way to capture, job satisfaction, essentially, right? Like who has a job that's finding it really fulfilling. And when I brought that back to OEO and we talked about it, we didn't necessarily come up with a clean way to do that exactly, but I did think, okay, well, if we at least have an employment retention measure like this, so we can say there's some time period that people are holding jobs, that might be, that might be a proxy for what Amy was talking about, right? Just because you're employed for 6 or more months doesn't necessarily mean you love your job, as we all know. But I think it does tell us there's some stability there, right? Certainly hasn't been something that's caused you to feel you need to leave, or maybe there's some wider economic stability too. The employers in the community aren't laying people off, so both of those I think that might help us gauge. Let's see. I think these are just crossed out because of the way we've revised the measures above. Okay, so the reach up changes. This is, basically I wasn't using the sanctioned and reach ahead information, the good standing information for anything. We're basically just trying to track and get an idea of, how many are enrolled in Reach Up and how many aren't. That's the priority from our perspective at OEO at this point. From what I understand, the sanctioned and reach ahead pieces were something that were added at some point at the request of FSH providers. Again, kind of like one of the other ones I mentioned earlier, I think the rent one. If I hear from a lot of you that, no, it's really helpful. It's really helpful to see those broken out. I don't need to remove those, but if I don't resoundingly hear that, I'm going to go ahead. I just don't know that we need to bother with getting that. And I think it's kind of similar to the family services piece too, right? Like, well, I will say people do tend to know when they're sanctioned, but they might not always understand reach ahead versus regular reach up services. They're probably going to keep calling it reach up to you. So, depending on whether or not you can get in contact with the Reach Up case manager, I think the quality of our data could vary here. So just going to simplify it. Okay, financial capability. What are the changes here? Some minor ones up top. I think this might have come from Amy as well in the work group, or maybe it came from someone else. I can't remember for sure. Percent number of families actively paying down debt on a schedule is what we had before. Well, basically came up, well, who cares if it's on a schedule, right? If they're paying down debt, that's great. So I agree, and so let's simplify that. Something to mention here that ICA brought up that I don't personally feel is a big deal, but if people disagree with me, please tell me. They don't feel it's best practice to reword existing measures because you technically are, changing what you're gathering midstream in kind of the history of gathering a data point, if that makes sense, right? Personally, I suspect that what you were reporting before, maybe you weren't really worrying that much about whether they're on the schedule. You were reporting people here who were just making steps to pay down debt. So I don't think rewarding it in this way causes a major data integrity issue for us. So I'm going to go ahead and tell ICA to do it unless somebody says, oh my God, Forrest, that's a terrible idea. Please don't. Similarly down here, I don't think this came out of the work group. It's just something that I, jumped out at me. I don't think we need to put emphasis on created necessarily. That the point is, are they using a budget and managing their finances that way? So I'm just going to simplify that one a bit. Let's see. Like I mentioned, getting rid of the checking account measure. I wasn't using that for anything. I didn't hear much from sites about working with families on checking. Not that that's a bad thing to do. Of course it isn't. But, the way the population looks to me, and I understand it, and kind of also from my previous work, I think a lot of the families you're working with may be coming in without access to non-predatory banking or financial services, right? They might be coming in with minimal or no savings. And so I think focusing our measures on those kinds of things and looking at how we're doing with that is more important than pulling out checking accounts per se, right? So to that point, adding a measure, a number of families with access to mainstream banking services at enrollment and currently, right? So that would be another one that's at intake and quarter end like these others. So the data guidance, I will give you a definition of what do we mean by mainstream banking services. I may tweak that terminology a little bit. I kind of have to look at the financial capability research and see how this is talked about, right? But what I'm getting at here is, like I was saying before, banking services that are non-predatory, so have friendly rates for FSH families, are readily accessible and usable and convenient, right? That help families meet the financial goals that they have. So that's what I would want to capture here. And again, so I'll write up, definition language around that. Yeah, I think those are the only changes there. And that's it. So to wrap it up, next steps, reviewing the updated report with you. That's what I'm hoping that somehow in the COVID-19 era here, you find a few minutes to do and look through this presentation and give me any feedback you have. Next week, I'm working with ICA on the changes. That's my hope. I have a call set up with them for Thursday, April 9th. If you are able to get me any kind of feedback, questions, comments you have on what you've seen here by the end of the day, next Tuesday, April 7th, that would be great. Again, I am considering what I've shown you here pretty much a final draft. I will add the side note I meant to say at the beginning that I really don't love doing things this way. What I had on the agenda for our in-person meeting in March, a big part of it was showing you all this in person, discussing it. That's really how I prefer to operate. So, but that said, this is a project that I and also the folks who are in the work group have put a lot of time into, and I want to move it ahead because if I don't, then it means waiting another year to do all this because, we're not going to change the report mid-year. So at any rate, that's why I'm just trying to keep this moving, and I sincerely apologize if doing it this way, it feels like it's, violating our usual mode of business and discussing these things together. But again, that's why I just hope, if at all possible, you can get me some feedback and comments because, I want to honor our collaborative process that we use. So anyway, the idea is the new report will be in place for, July 1st. We would do some training on it ahead of that. I think our next COP, which I hope we can do in person, would be in mid-June. So, that would be a big piece of the agenda there, right? Preparing you for reporting on this new report. And then, as I've kind of mentioned throughout, I have my next step now that I have a pretty good final draft of the report is to look at the data standards and develop some guidance, a manual for you so that we have better consistency on how we're reporting these in agreement. So that's it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking a look at these and keep up all the good work you're doing every day.